Hello, welcome to another edition of Hobby News Daily. I'm still Danny, and I am joined today by Cindy at Giant Legends and onhermark.com. How are you doing, Cindy?
I'm doing great, thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, absolutely. We talked. It was a little over a year ago,
Yes.
um, and you're a fascinating person to talk to, by the way. And
Well, thank you. It's the cards. It's about the cards.
it's all about the cards. But it was funny. I was talking to Anne Marie
Yeah.
from Women on Tops, and we
Yeah.
were saying smart people with cards are really fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very true. Very true. Yeah. I listened to the interview. It was great. I love her
Well,
witty, snarky sense of humor and her intelligence and, intellect, just awareness of what's going on in the women's cards today, particularly in the contemporary, because I don't do much with that. But boy, she just blows me away.
one of my good friends sent me a text message. He says, "I want her to be my best friend."
Yeah.
I was like, if that's what you come away from the interview, that's fantastic. I was like, I'd like to be your friend too. I don't know if that counts for anything, but I'm glad she made an impression.
Allies always count. Yes.
Yes, absolutely. So, one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about, and I brought it up briefly, is how you got started collecting in general. Because
Yeah.
all of us collectors have this thing in our brain that just won't let us walk away from stuff. Like it gets in there and then it doesn't leave. So when did you start and when did you kind of narrow in on your focus now?
I mean, I think the bottom line is I have a love of pictures, and that's what's always hooked me. As a kid in the 70s, I remember collecting baseball cards with my friends. I'm sure we stuck them onto our, tire spokes. I remember having a shoebox of them, and I probably sold them around 10 years old. And the only card I ever remember from that box was a Hank Aaron card, which I wish I still had today. And then I didn't think twice about them. And I was yard sailing when I was it was in the early 90s. I was doing a master's program at James Madison University. So I was living in Harrisonburg, Virginia, and I was just yard sailing. And I remember seeing this young boy with a table full of sports cards. And he must have mentioned, pointed out, like, here's a Minot Rayon card, who was an ice hockey goalie, and they
Really?
made a lot of cards out of her at the time, a very popular card to make and to sell. And that did bring me back in. I started going to sport card shows and to sport card stores. eBay wasn't much of a thing at all at that point, and just asking for cards. And to my knowledge, it was only contemporary cards that were out there. And then I was in one of these, like, small shows with toys and cards, and through the glass I saw a vintage card, and I literally felt like this electricity through my body. And I just knew that it's like, I don't know who she is, I don't know what she did, but I just knew I was onto something, and it was cool, but I didn't know what. And so I'm in school, I don't have a lot of money, so I'm just picking up things where I can, when I can. And I eventually was able to, like, narrow down a focus, to really focus my resources. And so that was basically pre 1972, so pre Title IX, authentic. And then the big caveat is that they needed to be printed around the time that the athlete competed. So I don't do aftermarket cards. I just felt like this is a good and a fair representation of what was going on in that day. And from there, I've
Playing
discovered a
career.
lot of amazing things. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of collecting playing career also. So
Yeah.
I think that's a good rule. You have to have some rules for sanity.
Oh yeah, I sometimes I'll pick out packs today just because I don't get the pleasure of the surprise. I don't get when I buy a card, I know exactly what I'm getting, and I think that's a big part of the fun, is the mystery of what's in the pack. And so I will buy on occasion contemporary, packs, just to see what's going on in the market, and just to have that fun of, like, what's in it.
I was wondering, you said you used to yard sale.
Yeah.
Um, I wonder, if there's not that same kind of like, what am I going to find? What's going to be hidden? Type
Yeah.
of thing there. Maybe you just have to go yard selling for cards again.
Yeah, it's Yeah, I have no expectations. I don't even have expectations when I go to shows, and I
So
don't go
that
to
was going to be my
many.
next question.
Yeah, yeah,
Where do you find? Okay, so we're talking about vintage women's
right.
cards,
Hmm.
um, sports and non-sports.
No, just sports. They have to
Just
be an athlete.
it has to be
Yeah.
sports. Okay.
Yep.
Um, and I know you go. Where does your collection start? What
The
year?
oldest card of an athlete is about 1887, 1888, and that's the Hattie Stewart boxing card from an
That's
American Tobacco Company. There's ones before that, and especially in the trade cards that show women doing things like bicycling or croquet or more like recreational activities, ice skating, but there's no way to tell that they were athletes. And so as athletic opportunities started to open more and more for women, and that late part of the 19th century, and definitely into the early part of the 20th century, we started seeing more and more cards of women as athletes. So 1887 is the oldest one. And again, I stop it at 1972, but this would be interesting. I've done like a statistical analysis of the cards that I have. So I track both the ones I own, and then I track the ones I've seen. And the ones I've seen, it's not 100%, pure. It's like I haven't tracked every card I've seen, but I've got a little bit over 2,000 that I own and a little over 3,100 that I've tracked. And of that, it represents, let's see, 34 sports, 27 countries. So they're from 27 countries. And the apex of the production was in the 1930s.
huh.
So if you look at it at a graph, it goes like from the 1800s and it goes up in the up into the 1930s, and then boom, down. And it never, even in the 1970s, it never ever gets back to where it was in the 30s and in numbers of production.
It's very interesting because baseball cards kind of have a dead period in the 30s where there was not the same level of production.
Yeah,
Um,
and you're probably also looking at from an American point of view, and that's the interesting thing about these cards is it's so international. Germany produced the lion's share of 44% of my collection. The UK is second with like 17%. Sweden is surprisingly third, and then comes in US and Holland. And so they're not significantly or statistically different from Sweden, US, and Holland, but it's such an international collection. It's really a neat way to look at women's sports around the globe.
do you have niches within women's sports that you try to, um, I hate the word attack, but conquer? That a certain athlete or a certain time period or a certain set that you go after?
So with the collection, I've been writing a book. And so I just realized that there's no way I'm going to go all the way up to 1972. I'll never finish it. And so it's a way of looking at women's sports through the lens of their own trading cards. And so I decided to end it around the beginning of World War II in 1940-ish. And so anything like pre-1940, that's what I'm focusing on right now. So, reasons for that: time, yes, and researchability, but also I personally find the older ones more interesting. Like the more contemporary they get, the less interested I am. And so it actually works both ways. It keeps my interest, in the research part, but also it just focuses it better too. And I feel like there is light at the end of the tunnel. So,
I was about to say, I
yeah,
think that we get back to some rules for sanity here.
yeah.
Um, so many directions. So you have from 1887 roughly to 1972,
Mm-hmm.
80, 90 years worth of cards that
Yeah,
you're covering. Um, how do you, this is a collector question. How do
yeah.
you physically organize your collection?
Notebooks.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, yep. I literally
Um,
have, I think it was Mitt Romney in one of the presidential debates years ago, many, many debates ago, who said somebody accused of him not having women in his cabinet. And he said, I have binders full of women. I'm like, I have binders full of women too. And so more or less they're by sport. And as soon as it started with like all in one binder. And then as the notebook got fatter and fatter, I just started putting like track and field, and swimming has its own book, and tennis has its own book, and figure skating has its own book. And so there's still like a multi-sport, but that's the best way: sleeves and notebooks for me.
That's it. Goes back to the thing in the brain for collectors. We have an organizational system that we all go by for
Yeah.
ourselves, and I love that. So I am collecting. I'm piecing now multi-sport athletes.
Mhm.
I I can go chalk and say Babe Dietrichson,
Yeah.
but give me somebody else I should look for that's
Mm.
that I'm gonna actually find the cards.
Yeah.
Am I missing anybody?
Oh,
I
yeah. I
know
mean,
I know I'm missing a ton.
yeah. I mean, some of them, it's hard to find what they did. They're a little bit more esoteric. They were probably really important to the country at that time, but maybe they didn't go to the Olympics, and so they're hard to find. I would say Sonia Henne has the most cards of any athlete out there. I think she has well over 100 different ones, whereas Babe only has a handful. It's interesting, both in track and field and I think I only know of 3 in golf. Althea Gibson's a great one. She's hard to find too. I only am aware of 3 of hers, and none were produced in the US, which I find fascinating.
And those, from what I've seen, have gotten pricey quick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. They came from England and Germany. So I've never seen the one from Germany, but and that's on my hunt list. I mean, there's just so many, and it's just hard to pick out just like a few.
Sure.
I'm preferential to track and field. I ran it in high school. I played college volleyball, but I just always loved the track cards for some reason the most. So like Helen Stevens, and I mean, just anytime I can find a card of somebody that I recognize now, it's just fun to see. It's like, I know you, thanks to the cards. I know who you are now.
The last time we talked, it was a little bit of a different atmosphere in sports and in women's sports. And you just mentioned you played volleyball. How many people did you typically play in front of?
Small crowds. It was a college in Maine, and we only traveled to Maine. So there's not many people in Maine to start with, let alone those that are going to come out to college to watch a women's game.
And what did they just set the record at in
thousands?
This year? I mean, tens of thousands, whatever the number was.
Yeah.
So
definitely. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was about to say, so women's sports, all of a sudden, everybody found out that they exist, I guess.
Yeah, and it's funny because we've been here all the time. Definitely skill levels increased, but so has the awareness. Media's catching up. We're still far behind on media coverage, but we're making inroads. I talked to somebody who she was a pitcher for a women's softball league in the 30s, 40s, 50s. Dot Wilkinson, she recently passed. She lived here in Phoenix. And she had this scrapbook of all the media. Yeah, she was. And she had a scrapbook of all the media that was covered. And she said, I wrote this article. I gave them this. I sent them this picture. I mean, so it was like everything that almost went out there, she or someone on their team had produced and fed it to the media because they had to. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been covered at all. And so for a while, even up to Holly Rowe, I mean, the announcer, she was pitching and paying for her own time of getting women's sports covered, and finally, it's caught up. So it's good to see, and it's such a great product and exciting.
It's, I think, also cool for a generation. I've got 3 kids, and they could not name a player in the men's basketball tournament. And I'm not going to make this a Caitlin Clark conversation, but they could name legitimately 5 to 10 female players.
That's awesome.
And they don't know that that's different.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
And that's like that to me and my wife, we talk about it all the time. Like, they're awesome to watch. Like we don't need to worry about anything else. The game's on. It's awesome to watch. Let's sit on the couch and open a soda. And it's for their generation. And my daughter's going to be 17. I got twin boys who are 13. So they're growing up not knowing the gap and the chasm between the two. And to me, that has changed so quickly, almost out of
Yeah.
nowhere.
It's a tipping point for sure. And it still has a ways to go, but it's going in the right direction at least.
So you talked about the 30s, being a big production era.
Mhm.
Was there other
Mhm.
historical eras that had, these types of blips? Is this
They
a cycle in history,
um,
or are we truly at a tipping point?
so what happened in the 30s, you had the 32 and 36 Olympics. And so trading cards were already immensely popular. And what makes trading cards separate from the sports cards today was that the images put on those tobacco cards and other products, they were selected because they were representing the product instead of just representing themselves or, Tops or whoever the company is. But I mean, it was tied to a product. And so as cards got more, popular in their production, and at the same time, women's sports opportunities were opening. With each Olympics, they went up a little bit. Then there was the Women's Olympic Games, which became the Women's World Games. Each few years, there were more women participating in sport, and they were still fighting against the your role as a mother, it's unfeminine, you'll never get married, all these things. But each country was also different. I don't want to get off on a tangent, but yeah, you can see in a graph, there's 1928, boom, and then 1932 and 36 are almost like similar. On my stats, 32 is actually higher than 36, but I'm not sure how that can be possible. And then after the war, or during the war, there was a paper shortage. And so they didn't produce cards very much at all. And then it just kind of changed. Tobacco cards fell out of vogue. In the U.S., of course, it was very strong in the gum card industry, and particularly around men's sports. But in women's sports, it never really followed suit as much. And so, yeah, the production of women's sports after the 1940s is just not the same. But now, yeah, they're really taking off, and both on the financial side, but also on the popularity side. And I agree with Anne-Marie, they're missing a huge opportunity by not selling or giving away cards at some of these big women's sporting events that
Well,
they could.
getting back to the volleyball, attendance, and I touched on some of the same conversation with her. Yeah, I think you have a captured crowd,
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
and like my kids, give them packs.
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
my son's into Pokemon. I would so much rather him be into WNBA. And please, nothing in the comments. I love Pokemon. I was kidding, but I would rather him learn more about the stuff that he's seeing on TV.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's how I learned my baseball history, and that's how I learned my sports history, was through cards.
Yeah, and there's something so magnetic about being able to hold that person in your hand. You hold your hero in your hand. It's like this close connection that you have that you don't have otherwise. And the fact that you can trade or you can sell, or, it's the surprise, you don't know who you're going to get, but it's this little, snippet, this little vignette of information that you can read about. And for me, that's what hooks me. I don't read for entertainment or recreation. I much rather do other things, but to write a book about it, I mean, that's my segue. That's my gateway drug is the cards to get me hooked to do more research.
Is there any more on the book? Any more details on the book you can share?
I'm still in process. I've submitted it several times to either literary agents or publishers. I did get an offer from one of the publishers, but their format was one and their distribution was one that didn't match how I pictured it to be. I have a certain look and feel of it, and it just wasn't that. And so I had to turn them down. It was really heartbreaking because it was like, oh, that close. So I keep trying. I'm looking for the right fit. I'm looking at like a kind of a coffee table style book, glossy pages, color, and with, of course, information about the athletes, background about the cards and what was going on in the history. Because that's to me, the fascinating part is how the cards and what we see in them, in the volume, in the wear, that's what's mirroring acceptable standards of women's sport around the country at different times. And that's the fun part, is that mirroring, that you can actually see it in the cards.
Well, I think sports has always mirrored society in different
Yeah,
ways,
yeah.
and so this is another example I think of or sports cards mirroring society. Um, yeah, go
One
ahead.
of my professors at Chalice McMillan was his name at JMU, and he would say, "Sports are a microcosm of society," and it's so true. It is. It's all the same, and sports just have the camera on them.
Um, so if this is a tipping point, and the Olympics historically were some of the biggest bumps, are we looking at possibly, the next, we've got Paris, but maybe 4 years after that, or even, the Women's World Cup? Or, historically, can we learn anything from that and look forward, to gain anything that might help us?
I think you hit it on the head with your kids not knowing the difference. It's the normalizing of women participate in sport and not having to make a big deal about it. That, fighting for this right to participate in sport. The fact that we have a women's hockey pro league now is fantastic. The fact that the female athletes are going to equalize the male athletes in the Olympics this time in Paris is like the first time ever. And so it's that normalization that we can change the focus of the discussion and looking at the athletes as athletes and looking at the amazing things they did. And I think we'll always have a better society when, boys and girls can see strong female athletes or female people, just, strong women,
Yes.
physically and, and their personality and their heart. And I think it's an equalizer.
I love that. My mother, my mother's a very strong woman. Was in business. She retired. She has written a couple books. She speaks, and so I never knew that mothers were supposed to stay home and cook, because my mother can't cook a pancake, and she would be the first one to admit that. So to find out that there was all these people out there in these terribly ancient gender roles in my lifetime.
Mhm.
I'm so thrilled that in my kids' lifetime, we're talking about this change. And
Yeah.
better than that, their kids' lifetime, what we'll
Yeah.
be talking about is, why is there a women's professional hockey league? Because there's too many concussions in hockey. And that's when things will be equal.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
When we can argue about concussions,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
all the things that we've been arguing about, that'll be normalized, and I look forward to the leagues getting to that part where we can have the sports conversations, not just the gender conversations.
I agree. My other, beef with about on the media coverage side is that I don't stream things. I don't have cable. My access to TV is network and free network, and the fact that so many of these leagues don't get onto ABC, NBC, CBS. And I think the women's tournament was last year, and they're like, "Wow, we had the largest record ever." Well, of course you did. It's free. Everyone can watch it. You don't have to have ESPN.
Yeah.
So when there's more women's games on the network stations, I think that's another huge step forward for women's sports.
Absolutely. And I'll say this in general, the more collaboration that the other leagues will do, like the NBA has done,
Hmm.
it does so much more than I think people realize. Anything from the 3-point shootout with Steph Curry and Sabrina
Yeah.
Ionescu, to just having the WNBA pair with the NBA teams in some of the cities to really form like one large, basketball presence. And I wish that baseball would reach out a little bit more. I'm going to get on my soapbox for a second. As a baseball lover, I wish that we would find a way to bridge that gender gap a little bit. I don't know if that's a lack of interest in leaving softball for baseball, if softball just stands alone. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
My understanding with the history, both women and men played softball in the early incarnation of the 20th century and 19th century, and that women, it got divided for some reason, and I could be wrong on this, don't forgive me, but that, the men didn't like playing with the larger ball. It was just harder. And so men went towards baseball and women got stuck with softball, which is a great sport. And then, of course, what I was saying about the 30s, 40s, 50s, before the NCAA women's soccer, co-ed leagues and adult leagues and female leagues were huge in this country. Absolutely huge. Like they'd have national tournaments. So I don't know. It would be nice if people could play the sport they love.
Yes.
And in a fair setting, and that's the tricky part, is like the fair setting part. In other words, the guy wants to play field hockey, does he get to play on the field hockey team? And is that fair? That's a whole different argument. That's when now we're going away from cards entirely. But
I will need another 6 hours for that. But my wife always makes a good point that if you don't teach people when they're young, they're not going to succeed when they're older.
Absolutely.
And it doesn't matter what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So she said, listen, she would have been a football fan much younger. Nobody ever taught her the rules.
Yeah.
And she said at no point in growing up in school were the girls ever taught the rules to football. And she said it's just silly. She wasted half her life, avoiding something that turns out she likes watching football. And
it's a great team sport for strategy, in particular. I'm not a big fan for the head injury.
Well, that's what, exactly. Yeah. Getting back to the concussions. But so anyway, I just, I just think that starting young and in any way, whether it's education, whether it's participation, is crucial. And since you're a historian, I think that, the history has to be taught and it has to start young, because otherwise people are not going to want the cards.
And that's interesting what you're saying about it's great to have this evolution of fairness and equal opportunity and recognition and salaries. And at the same time, and this is really key, God, we got to remember where we came from too. We got to remember the struggles that women went through to even play and the fight that they went through. And so this is the catch-22, the double-edged sword of any kind of progress, is forgetting what people went through. And so I think these cards are just a wonderful time capsule. The difficult thing is, though, that thing about a picture says 100 words or 1,000 words. It doesn't. You see it, and I did too. I'm guilty of seeing certain things in older cards the way I would look at it today. And it's understanding, that history that came with it, that just adds this really rich layer. The fact that these women had cards at all. And so, for me, they're the time capsule and they're the keepers of women's sports, is these trading cards. And I find them so much more interesting than like a history book. I mean, I'm writing a book, but, right. I would much rather look at cards and than perhaps, just read A through Z of women's history, So
absolutely.
And I guess that's just because I'm a lover of pictures. That's where we started.
Well, and you're a lover of cards and history, so it's nice when they all actually, put them together for us.
Yeah. I mean, again, the fact that manufacturers knew that these women were representing their company, they put them on there intentionally. They picked women, athletes. I mean, that speaks volumes.
Well, and not to start another conversation, but they didn't pick them just to sexualize them.
Right. There's only about the 1880s that we see that in the cards. And there are more drawings. Sorry?
And then back again in the 1980s.
Yeah. I mean, it's a huge part of research today. But in this time period that I collect, it's this very controversial sexualizing in the late Victorian era that was scandalous, absolutely scandalous, and we look at them today and they're pretty, PG, but back then, women, were dressed from neck to ankles. They didn't show skin. So you see them in like a particular gymnastic series where they're drawn and doing things that no gymnast would really do. And then because it was so scandalous, they went away from that. And from what I can tell, especially looking at it from an international level over different decades, there just seems to be a lot of respect for how they're portrayed. And I can compare them sometimes to, men in the same set. Are they in the same like non-action pose? Yes, sometimes, and are women in a non-action pose and men are in an action pose or in live action? And just looking at how they were portrayed.
That's fascinating. Every time I talk to you, I end up doing an hour worth of.
I'm hooked, and I love being able to share.
Absolutely. And every time we talk, I want to spend an hour on eBay when we're finished. And you somehow cost me money as I learn. So it's always worthwhile. Now, one thing before we leave, because I'm collecting, I told you, multi-sport players.
Mm-hmm.
I did pick up.
Oh yeah. Yeah, the Sinella card. Yeah, that's what I call it anyways.
Yeah, it's the thin paper. Uh-huh. It's not the same stock, but it's a starting place for me. Mm-hmm. in my vintage collection. So this is card number 1.
Awesome. You picked a good one.
Thank you. All right, Cindy, it is a pleasure as always. I try to keep it to 15 minutes, but for you, somehow we talk for just half an hour. You're an unbelievable guest. I encourage people to talk to you and to seek you out. You're a wealth of knowledge, and thank you for coming on.
Thank you. And check out the @Giant Legends page. I post cards here and there now and then. But that's my main source of putting these out into the world right now until a book is published. But thank you, Danny. Yes. Thanks for the opportunity. It's always a pleasure speaking with you too.
Well, thank you. And to everybody else, we'll see you next time on Hobby News Daily. Take care.